Hello there. Looking forward to today. How can we avoid the mute trap? Um, that just came up as a result of several conversations I've had over the last few days, and decided it's time to circle back around on the using your voice conversation, and more specifically this time talking about um, when speaking up feels like a trap, and because it's very real, right? When it comes to what's going on in the world around us, when it comes to speaking up on behalf of our family or friends or whatever the case may be. So we're going to explore that a little bit today. Before we get too far along, please don't forget, or please remember to hit the thumbs up and subscribe so that these videos can get pushed out to more people who want and need to hear um, what's being shared and to gather their input along the way. Okay, so here's the thing. The I'm always going to be about using your voice, and when you say like using your voice, what does that mean? I'm talking specifically about speaking up, being an advocate, challenging the status quo, and a lot of times most times people presume that to be confrontational in nature. And that's not necessarily the case, right? Um, Oftentimes people view it as being confrontational when they are on the defensive as opposed to the offensive and aren't being open to receiving criticism or listening to the other side. All right. We're not talking about those people now. We're talking about you and what it means and looks like when you feel the need to speak up or want to speak up about something, but you're feeling trapped by your circumstances from being able to do so freely. And I must say that I absolutely understand and can connect to this because we have to make sure the mic is on because I've had moments um, where I forgot to do it, but where throughout my career, depending on where I was working at the time, it was not appropriate for me to comment on certain things, specifically and in particular if it was in reference to some political or policy things. Because at the time, let's say I worked for a state agency or I worked for a specific member of the legislature, and so, you have to be mindful of what you say about certain things because it can be taken as being attributed to a stance that your boss might take, right? Get that. That comes with the territory. So the first thing is recognizing what your position is more clearly, because sometimes it is a matter of the position you are in your company, in your organization, um, uh, who you work for, if it is for, let's say, a governmental entity or a elected official. Like, unfortunately, that's the reality of things that come with that territory. And so when you take on those positions and or you're in one, like making sure it's clear on what some of the parameters are, because a lot of times those parameters are give in context to the specific work that you're doing, right? So for example, state government or governmental employees, to try and put a muzzle on them for everything that could possibly come up in their lives, like that just sounds wrong, right? Because hello, First Amendment speech. And there are moments where, let's say I worked in education and I was a senior executive in several realms, uh, both in a governmental agency standpoint and from a elected official standpoint. And there were times where literally, if I wanted to support someone, let's say who was running for a local office, even if it was local, it didn't even have to be statewide, but let's say if it was local office, or for, I think it came up in terms of, um, I was very active in this in the bar association, and there were people. And at the time, I was working for, the lieutenant governor of the state of Texas. So when I was asked for an endorsement, I was like, you can use my name, but you cannot use where I work, right? Because that was a prohibition. That was something that could reflect on my boss as if he was endorsing this person when it was not. That was my personal endorsement, right? So that's one way where it can show up, and definitely other ways. And so there were times when, I would not be able to speak out publicly on certain issue when it came to education policy, because I held a very high ranking position in the education agency at the time. And there were um, things that either the commissioner needed to speak on, the deputy commissioner, or whatever. Like if I was engaged in a conversation about my particular area, perhaps that could be. So like, yeah, it sounds like, oh, you're making all the exceptions, but the point is, it matters where you work and who you work for. So let's say if you're a nonprofit organization, it could be that if you're a senior leader in that it's mindful, because you have to be mindful of sources of revenue, right? Of, grants and things like that. So unfortunately, it is a reality. And that does not mean you are locked down forever, or in being able to speak up on anything that affects your life, because that's not the case. And unfortunately, we get trapped into feeling like that is, even when it's not. So it's a matter of really stepping back and a little bit from the emotion of the situation, whatever it might be, and let's get some clarity around where it is I work, and the things where commentary might be more limited, versus this is something that's very personal to me and something completely unrelated to my work, right? Let's say if you're, in favor of a certain cause. Most of the time, most of the time, these issues come up when there's politics involved. Let's just be honest, right? Um, Sometimes it might be some other issue. It could be a issue of healthcare or support for certain things, which in and of itself generally would not cause angst. But it's when things get politicized that a whole new light gets shed on them. And that, in reality is very unfortunate, but it is the thing that happens, and it's common in our world. So, that said, recognizing where you work and where your status or where you fall in leadership and how that impacts you is the first thing. The next thing is really coming to terms with, is this something that you cared so deeply about that you would change your status if it comes to it? Because sometimes it can be that serious. People have life changing situations all the time where they realize, they've had like a near death experience, or the death, or something traumatic happening to a family member. And they realize, you know what, I can't work in this arena anymore or stand up for these things, because I need to be able to speak more freely to advocate for this particular issue, this particular person, or whatever. That is a reality. It's not for everyone, and it's not for every situation. But it does come up, and it is something that people need to be willing to consider and to think about. I know for years there were certain things politically that I would not touch on my personal page, not even talking about professionally, but in my personal, because number one, I was connected very much with people from my professional world on some of my personal social media. So there's that. And recognizing that people take things out of context or they can just run with it. And so there were times when there were things I really, really cared about, but I did not do so publicly. And that's one of those options. It's like sometimes you have to recognize when something can be shared publicly and you really need to dive in, or maybe there's a more private way in order to support or to advocate for something. And again, that can be very subjective. Now, there are going to be people who are going to be the extremes. Well, if you care about something that important, then um, you really should go out and say something. And in an ideal world, does that work? Sure. We do not live in an ideal world. And if you do, it's only for about 5 seconds and then things just explode and you have to come back to reality, right? So I really want folks to think about these things because as you progress in your career, um, in your positions in the community, all of these things, like things are going to shift. And your capacity to be more vocal, I hope, become stronger as you age, as you gain more experience, right? Because folks will, for lack of a better word, respect and honor what you have to say more without necessarily taking offense at it. I mean, I found that to be true for myself. And I have literally become much more vocal. I don't work for, political entities anymore. I and so I made an active decision several years ago that I was going to be more vocal about some things. And even then, I still had to ease into it because that was a very real mindset that I lived under for most of my career. Even when I was lobbying for particular issues, there was still a difference between lobbying for something, again, for my job from an interest standpoint, and advocating for something even more so because there was a personal connection, right? And you might say, well, aren't those just the same, two of the same things? Not necessarily. And that's not to say that I was never one of those lobbyists that would just go lobby for junk and for the dollars, right? So that was never me, which is why there were certain things I never would. If I didn't believe in it in some fashion, um, on a personal level, but just professionally could honor it, then I wasn't going to do it because that that just went against my personal values. That's me. Everyone has their line that they will or will not cross. So that's the other piece that you always have to be thinking about, or recognize when you get to a certain point. That I'm like, yeah, I think I'm done towing this line. Because you do get to that point. I mean, I know that I got to that point more recently, and certain things that I normally, that's going on out in the world, I would not comment on in a public setting in writing, because that's completely contrary to anything that I've ever done, for all the reasons I've stated. But I was just like, this is just wrong, and I'm over it. And I have the agency to be able to speak up in a way that's for me that I feel is responsible to acknowledge, hey, I believe that there's a problem here and it's something that people need to be more aware of. You can go make whatever choice of decisions that you want, but I'm always going to be on the side of, if I'm using my voice to advocate for something, to do so in a responsible way, because I do know that people have built up a certain respect or certain things that come around. Because I did have folks who were like, "Oh my goodness, if you said something, I know like it must be really bad," and so that's being responsible with your voice as you have it. If you're still developing it, then holding back is not about constriction as much as it is about learning where your lines are, about exercising sound judgment, and really and truly not doing something rash that you will regret later. And so that's where you can be very passionate about an issue. I mean, trust you me, there are things that I go off privately about, uh, or in private conversations where I'm extremely vocal and stuff. But I may not put that in writing and throw it out to the world right now, right? Because that's not how I want to use or leverage that. And you're saying it's like, oh, well, that sounds so complicated. It's really not. We're talking about personal values, your personal capacity to be expressive, acknowledging the realities of what world you live in with your job, with your responsibilities, all of those things, and then your, like I said, your personal values and what it is that you've decided this is the line I'm willing to cross or to speak up more about. And I know that if there's some not necessarily a conflict, because I'm never going to advocate for you having a conflict of interest in how you speak on something, but absolutely divulging or releasing a conflict, like that's working with honor and respect, um, in those matters, right? I was speaking with a friend and a colleague recently who's younger than me, has kids that are younger now, and about how sometimes our service on boards or in the community may influence whether or not we serve in certain positions, because let's say a board may say, well, we want to be mindful of certain things because of who our constituency is, or who our audience is for this board, right? And so sometimes it may be that there could be something that you might not totally agree with, and you want to be more vocal about it, but needing to monitor that. Well, that could be one of those places where you decide, I can't serve on this board because I feel uh, much more strongly about being able to speak to issues that may arise, and as a result, and I don't want to be in conflict with that, right? Which is a legitimate concern. I've had those types of things to arise as well. And so you're like, well, what can you do? Well, first of all, one of the things is to remember when you get those feelings of being trapped, recognize, like, what are they coming from? And which is why I said, think about where you're working, who you work for, what is it about it that's causing you to feel that, um, to have those feelings, and then making that decision about, well, what are you willing to give or not, and if you can or cannot, because those are decisions that only you can make, right? And how you engage. But it really gets down to this next level of how you can engage, because so often we can engage more in more ways than we think, right? Whether it's donating money to a cause or volunteering for a cause in a different way. Even if you're not able to be the person in front of the camera advocating. Most people aren't trying to do that, right? But they do want to be able to say or do something. And so this is how a lot of, when it comes to state employees or employees of governmental entities, they're able to engage in ways that are not, quote, as visible out there. They're not going to be writing, you know, uh, blogs about an issue necessarily, but perhaps what they can do is donate to a cause or volunteer some time with something. Those things can come up. Again, context, recognizing where the limits and the boundaries are for the work that you do. And if that becomes an issue, recognizing that you have to make a decision on which one is more important for you at that moment, right? Um, so that, those are ways. Sometimes it can be, providing support behind the scenes on things. Or if you happen to have a good relationship with someone who is in a position to say some things, that if you're able, and again, if there's not a conflict of interest, to, to share your thoughts or your concerns about something in that way, right? Just because you may not be the person to be able to be on the front lines, with a sign, doesn't mean that you can't have influence and an impact, and that you can't use the voice that you have in order to influence the situation, because you can. That's where I'm getting to. You absolutely can, right? It just may not look like what everybody is always thinking about when it comes to that. And so I just want to encourage you to do that and to recognize it. And if nothing else, to recognize you always have the agency to stand where you are in your beliefs, with your passions, to speak up on behalf of things and people. I'm never going to be the one, oh, you shouldn't do that. And I'm going to say, be mindful of those things, because sometimes you can go and be willing to speak up, but you also have to recognize where you may, uh, something may be at risk, or you may lose something as a result of it. Again, those are very individual decisions. When I coach people who work in sensitive leadership positions and have to toe that line, like, we have those conversations, and my response to those clients is very individual. There is no blanket answer for it, because that person's specific set of facts and their situation does matter. And so I'm always making sure uh, to modify my recommendations, or uh, my input to how they should respond, or be able to speak up, or do whatever in a way that works for them within the realms of their current um, professional position, community position, whatever it might be. Okay. So I hope that's helpful to someone out there who's feeling, you're feeling trapped, and you don't want to be muted. You don't have to be muted. A lot of times we're muting ourselves. I recognize that over the years, more so that I was doing more muting of myself than other people were. I was feeling pressure to do and to say less because of certain things, and let it go too far. So we have to do that little self evaluation, because sometimes we're putting a pressure on ourselves that's not really there. I want to put that out there, and for you to consider as well. All right, think about that. All right. So, okay, Patricia here. I think I forgot to introduce myself. So, if this is your first time joining in, so glad to have you here, um, and welcome. I want to remind you that I'm always here to help professionals, particularly women, professionals and entrepreneurs, to help them empower their growth, and to do so in a way that they can pursue their lives with clarity, with authenticity, and definitely being on purpose, right? And to not feel that trapped, that to not feel stuck where they are, but rather to be able to transform the out of those situations, beyond those situations, so that they can do what's right for them, as opposed to just what's right for someone else all the time, because that will leave us feeling stuck. Okay. And as I finish up, do not forget to hit the thumbs up, to subscribe, share things out, and to always remember that you absolutely must celebrate who you are every day, and remembering that celebrating yourself is the power move. All right. It is a power move, and I want to encourage you to do it. Take care, everyone, and we'll talk with you again tomorrow.